The way that I'm framing up the Critias in my own understanding and interpretation of it is that nothing can really be left ignored. It's almost like a Hitchcock film.
They're showing us, they're modeling in this particular text, the importance of you pass on a tradition via making up your own stories.
Strife is absolutely necessary, for our waking up.
Oh, dear diadema, tell me why do the things that are beautiful always have a darker side? Oh, dear diadema, tell me why is the good never good enough? Underneath the dirt and scar is an old and familiar face.
All right, welcome back to another episode of The Ladder, Journeys in Platonic Mysticism. Today we're going to do something a bit different. We're going to explore a text of Plato's, one that is slightly obscure and enigmatic. It's called the Critias. And joining me are two amazing colleagues, Ike Baker from the podcast Arcanium, and Greg Shaw, author of Theology and the Soul, expert in Iamblichus and the late Neoplatonic tradition. I found that this text is one of the most enigmatic Platonic texts that I've ever read and reread. And I wondered what would happen if we did a kind of book club where we all, right, despite the fact that none of us are experts in this particular text, what could we learn from each other reading this very strange text? So the background is that we have Plato's Timaeus, and in Plato's Timaeus, it begins with a kind of allusion to the Republic and the beautiful Calipolis or utopian city that Socrates constructs in that particular dialogue. And in the Timaeus, it seems as if the Republic has taken place the day before. I have arguments for why I don't think that that is the case. I think that the summary of the Republic that Socrates gave Timaeus and Critias and Hermocrates is actually a younger version, right, or a more immature version of the Republic that he's been reciting for years, but I won't get into that particular argument. But these three fellows, sans one other invitee who is too sick to show up, have come to Socrates to have a feast of words as a thanksgiving for what Socrates did the day before, as far as building this Calipolis or this utopian city. And Timaeus' gift is a cosmology. He constructs the world, how it was born from the demiurge and Cora, and the creation of the world soul and our embodied lives from a mixture of reason and necessity. And so Timaeus gives this amazing cosmology, and then after it's over, Critias goes. Now, Critias is given a prelude to his feast of words, his thanksgiving to Socrates in the Timaeus, which is, I vaguely remember this particular story about a city that actually did exist, and that city was Athens, and it was exactly as you had it, Socrates, but it was a long, long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, 9,000 years ago to be precise, and it's a story that I heard from my grandfather when I was a little kid, and I vaguely remember all of these little details, and we'll get into those details in just a second. But basically, to hop into the story, this is the infamous myth of Atlantis, right? And that this is how Critias is going to say thank you to Socrates for the Calipolis. So this is his response speech, and he basically wants to say this is historical fact that Atlantis existed, and this is not the perfect city. This is the tyrannical city that warred with Athens, which was the perfect city. So people who think that Atlantis was the utopia, they haven't actually read their text. But who am I to be a stickler? But in any case, the point is that now we have the dialogue, the Critias, and most people, for some strange reason, don't read this follow-up where we get this kind of, first off, a description of what Athens was like and its beautiful tripartite perfect nature. And then it moves to Atlantis, talking about it's more divine craftsmanship, right? There's a kind of difference that Athens is the Callipolis in its kind of perfect telos of mortality. But then we get the different picture of Atlantis, and Atlantis born from Poseidon and his wedding with Pluto, the beautiful daughter, and the creation of this island with 8 rings, if I remember correctly, different levels, and a set of 5 twins as the sons of Pluto and Poseidon. And there's all sorts of interesting obscure details about the look of the land, the nature of their piety, so on and so forth. But the text seems to abruptly end, right? Right when this island people are starting to lose a certain kind of faith and reverence for virtue and the divine, and then just ends. Just ends. You're left wanting. You're thinking, what would have happened if there was the rest of this text? And so you have to ask yourself, did Plato end it like this on purpose, or did he decide to go ahead and write something else? In any case, we'll talk about that in just a second. And so I hope that was a succinct summary of the Timaeus and the Critias, and now we can kind of just jump into the opening. It opens with Timaeus finishing his cosmology, and I want to note that in the Timaeus begins his likely story of the coming into being of the cosmos, saying that it's right and true and just to pray to the gods before starting any endeavor. But weirdly, he doesn't pray. He just goes into the cosmology. But then, when you read the Critias, things make a little bit more sense. So I'm going to read the opening paragraph. How gladly do I welcome my release, Socrates, for my protracted discourse, even as a traveler who takes his rest after a long journey. And I make my prayer to that God who has recently been created by our speech, although in reality created long ago. And so basically, he's ending his likely story by saying that the entire likely story of the coming into being of the cosmos and the birth of the world, so this God that he's talking about, this was his prayer. That his entire philosophical activity was the prayer itself. I just think that's a beautiful way to open.
Yeah, absolutely. Greg, do you have any thoughts? I don't want to cut you off for you.
Well, I do, but go ahead, because if you got one you're right on the tip of your tongue, go for it. But I do have a thought. I can bring up something on that first paragraph.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, there are, just to point out the obvious, there's this, idea of virtue, but I tend to see, kind of like as I said in the beginning, I tend to see, I said this off camera to you guys, but I tend to see Plato as constructing these grand, or maybe subtle mythologies. I see him as participating in a tradition of mythographers that were present along the lines pre-Socratically, in the pre-Socratic tradition that he sort of follows in, like the Orphic and Pythagorean and so on and so forth. So he's, I think that, and this is just something that I kind of always preface anytime I'm about to talk about a Platonic dialogue with. I think everything is significant. Every line is significant. Every way that he chooses to exemplify something, any way that he delineates something, it's, I don't think a lot of people are clued into the minute level of architecture behind these things. We're used to reading fiction. We're used to sort of a more modern understanding of how and why you would write something, right? It's sort of commercial in nature to modern people. But again, to state what is likely painstakingly obvious to the both of you, but maybe not so to everyone listening, I think that the key to a lot of, particularly the Timaeus, the Republic, and then the way that I'm framing up the Critias in my own understanding and interpretation of it is that nothing can really be left ignored. It's almost like a Hitchcock film. Everything has this little sort of very, very predestined place.
No, but I mean, like, he's like, even in the opening line, because he says this has been his protracted journey, right? Like, this has been a long journey. And so he's definitely giving a hat tip. Like, here, I just created a world, and it's been a long journey in that world. So please, and so it's very Odyssean, right? Like that he's giving that nod that the entire cosmology was a kind of movement, a journey itself. And that's a prayer, right? Like that when you live this way, right? When you're creating these stories, these ikos mythos, this, yeah, you're gonna, this is the prayerful life. And so I definitely agree. It's one of the reasons why I wanted both of you guys to help me through this text, because I know that there's some sort of minutia that I'm missing because I just don't have the same esoteric background as both of you. And so, but yeah, so Greg, you were going to say something about the opening?
The Timaeus speaking. It really struck me when he says, so I make my prayer to the God who's been born but in our tale, so that the whole story that he told, which is the Timaeus, is the God, that he has, in a way, done some magic of creating a God in his story. There's a sort of a magical practice going on here through his narrating of the cosmology. And that kind of struck me as a powerful thing to say. And then he goes on to say, all right, I think we're on the right track here. But if we go off track, he says, the right penalty is that he who strays from tune should be brought back to it. Strays from tune, loses the music of the discourse. And that really struck me also as that, what is the tune? They're all sort of intuitively kind of in sync with some sort of vibe, I'll call it a vibe, that Timaeus has just revealed to them as the God. And at the very end of the Critias, which is not really an end, but an abrupt stopping, that Zeus is about to discipline these Atlanteans for losing their virtue and give them a discipline that might bring them back to tune. So there's a sense that there's a tune, and I don't want to sound too interdisciplinary religious studies here, but I think that in the Indian tradition, there's a term called rita, which is like the music of reality, that reality is imagined as a kind of musical construction, a song, if you like. There's some kind of, they're tuning in to something that they believe exists, and that what Timaeus did in his telling of his cosmology was to basically invoke the God by speaking his creation story. And that's a pretty big deal to do. Now, as far as Critias's actual story here, maybe I was just too dense to really see through it, or maybe just reading my English translation didn't open it up to me. So I'd be very interested to know if there are any sort of like glimpses of something deep that either one of you have found in the Critias. Because I mean, apart from the obvious, okay, this is how it's arranged. There are 5, sons, and this Poseidon and Clito, and, but I took that more on a sort of just a literal level instead of I didn't get a lot of insight from it. So help me out.
Well, just to kind of hop onto your singing and hymn, like think about Socrates' response, right? Which like totally marries or is in concord with everything that you just said. So first off, they've made a compact. So I think you're absolutely 100% right that there's a kind of ritual, kind of magic kind of thing happening here, because they've made a compact, and this is what they have to do and to be in accord with each other, which is to give each other speeches that bring into life, to animate, right, the Republic, or animates the Callipolis or the Utopia that Socrates has put in speech. So really makes it come alive. So makes it a living statue, right, so to speak. So they're doing that work of animating words, animating a speech, making it really embodied in each of them, showing Socrates, proving to Socrates that we've heard what you said, and we are now creators of mythologies or stories or people, so on and so forth. And that here, when Socrates responds to Critias's request, so Critias, after Timaeus has passed the baton, says, hey, Timaeus got some forbearance, or got some, what is the word I'm looking for, leniency about his story, because he was talking about the creation of the universe, and all we can ever have is a 99% story. We can never have the perfect, absolute scientific story. This is always a likely story. Even to this day, every story about the coming into being, the cosmos, is what you're reaching for. It's the best approximation that science can give. And so Critias kind of stops and says, I want the same leniency. And I think I should have more, because I'm going to be talking about mortals, right? And this picture of the emergence of mortals in this particular story is a whole lot more familiar to people. So it's kind of like looking at a painting, he says, where when we look at a painting of the gods, we're like, okay, we'll let them get away with it. It could be, the blue phase or whatever, because we really don't know what's going on with the gods. So you can make a picture of a dot and call it Poseidon, and we'll be okay with that, right? And that's to be hyperbolic. But he's just saying, when it comes to human beings and pictures of human beings, we tend to be more critical. So please, guys, give me a little bit more leniency, even though this is historical fact. And then Socrates basically says that, yeah, you're right. This is the theater of it all. So, and giving this kind of hat tip to the drama that is occurring. And he even calls Timaeus a poet, right? And it calls what Timaeus just did a hymn, and then basically says, this is now your turn to be, the paean, and to be inspired by Apollo and the Muses. And then Critias comes back and says, not only should I pray to Apollo and the Muses, I need to pray to memory, right? This is the goddess that really will help me to remember this story that I was told when I was a kid, getting ready for a festival, and a festival that's all about telling made-up stories, by the way, that my grandfather told me, and my grandfather heard it from his friend, who heard it directly from Solon, and Solon heard it from the Egyptian priest, and then Allah. He tells the story. And so, no, I do think that there's something to what Ike was just saying about, they're showing us, they're modeling in this particular text, the importance of, you pass on a tradition via making up your own stories that actually are encoded with different little pieces of symbolism, that if you understood and you collect stories from other people, you might actually be able to also create and make animated statues with your words, or with your hymns, or with your way of life. And so that's, for me, one of the coolest things about this text.
One point that you refer to that Critias brings up himself is that what he's doing is a lot harder than what Timaeus did, because he's talking about things that people are familiar with. And so they have some something in the game. What's that called? Anyway, yeah, right. They're in stake. They have a stake in the game because they're living it, and it's a lot easier to talk about a place where we don't live, and we're imagining gods up there like little dots, as you put it, or whatever we want to imagine. Nobody can criticize this because nobody knows. But you start to talk about what people are like, and people, and so you're going to be very critical of the descriptions that someone says. So what strikes me here is that I think they want to bring that whole divine structure in and make it accessible in real life. And making it accessible in real life is subject to incredible amount of criticism. because real life, we all kind of know what it is. But I think that's, in a way, the only real task. A Platonism of every religion is, how do you bring that divine world into an incarnate expression? And that's the magic, the real magic. They're in a sense, you could say they're kind of doing it through sharing speeches and sharing stories. So that's a step in the right direction. That's their way of staying in tune. But the music is, you call it eternal music, and they're trying to pick up on it. But I think that's the hard thing to do. I mean, that's the whole task. How do you incarnate the divine into the mortal? And that's kind of what he's talking about. I think that's one way to look at it.
Yeah, and I mean, there's a whole context here that I think, if you understand classical Greece and right, nobody writes anything, does anything. This conversation right now that we're having does not take place in the vacuum of our conversation. There's, or within the strict confines of it. There's all of this context and this idea of particularly dianoia and approaching noesis with it, that sort of stratification of that the divided line delineates, or something that we get in like the seventh letter, where Plato's not to me, I don't see Plato there as effectively categorizing in this Aristotelian sort of context that we just hyper tend to see Plato through the Aristotelian sort of interpretation of it. But I see him showing, like, look, do you see what your mind does? Do you see how you're gradually brought lower and lower towards illusion? But the whole purpose of dialectic and of this kind of tapping in and approximating or moving closer to the noetic via dianoia is a hieros logos, a holy speech. And especially when somebody like Timaeus is embodying this mythological account of cosmology, yes, but also of cosmogony, the creation of the cosmos and the creation of the gods. He is doing something that I think personally, Greg would probably know better according to his own experiences and the textual sources, but I think it's very theurgic in an iamblician sense. He's recreating the cosmogony in all of that. So yeah, it's interesting because nobody really, what's great about them when they're on a roll, nobody interrupts, which is really, there's like, okay, he's hot, right? It's like in jazz, right? Like he's taking a solo, like nobody
Nobody interrupt, man.
Yeah, he's tuned
We're
in.
gonna hear the craziest of riffs. No, I mean, but like when we think about the fact that in the Republic, the first thing that Socrates does is he talks about the importance of music and having that music have a certain kind of rhythm, and so that yes, like this is how we get into these sort of stories. This way of life is this. These are the myths. These are the stories that we tell each other, and if they get into our hearts, right, when we're young, then who knows? Can we go further, right? And so that these are the initiatory myths in some such sense, right? That bring us to be like, because like, I have to be honest. When I first read the Timaeus, I was not a fan. I heard wah 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 music, world soul, Cora. But why? Because it's highly complicated. But what was so interesting, and I hope you guys have had this experience, that's actually part of the initiation into the philosophical life is you don't understand, it's confusing, but some light bulb is still going off where you're like, there's still something here, and it's my fault, right, that I didn't get it. It's not the text, it's really just, it's asking me, try again, try again, try again. And so, of course, I've now read the Timaeus a billion times, and now it's one of my favorite texts. And, the Critias being the obscure follow-up. And it's about the myth of Atlantis, something that still captures the hearts and minds of people to this day. I just cannot help but see it as, because, like, for all it's worth, like, nobody in our popular culture remembers Timaeus's cosmology except for people like ourselves, right? But everybody, even people who have never read any Plato whatsoever, and they don't remember Critias's name, but they remember Critias's story. And that's pretty powerful in my
They
eyes.
don't remember
So
his
yeah,
story. They've sort of layered over a fantasy on top of
yeah.
his story. And I wonder what you
Mhm.
make of that. I mean, how did Atlantis become, and I'm sure there's probably somewhere in Renaissance writers or just after them, where people began to write about Atlantis as a way of a kind of a perfect place. But it's sure not in the Critias. And yet in popular
Mhm.
imagination, Atlantis is seen as this sort of divine and wonderful place. And um and I don't like to use this term much, but I do sometimes. Among the so-called New Age kind of circuit, Atlantis is almost spoken of with sort of reverence. Oh, wonderful Atlantis. And you know these people far better than I do, and you know how they think and talk about Atlantis, right? What is going on? They've sort of made it into a kind of ideal place that we've lost and we want to get back to, and yet Zeus is just about to kick their ass because they're so screwed up.
Yeah, well, a lot of that comes through at least the more, I would say, the more new agey kind of appropriation of that mentality comes through theosophical and post Blavatsky and theosophical writings that kind of went all over the place, because we see during this time period um a real veneration, in almost like, putting it on a pedestal, this legend. And this happens so many times in cultures where we look back and I mean, he might even be doing it, Critias might be doing it about Athens, and like make it, because it's so much older, and so, and therefore likely agrarian and so far away from the troubles of today, that there's this veneration. And really, I think what it is there's a major psychological mechanism there that wants to project the archetype or the ideal as something that we have strayed from. And I mean, who knows? There could be a soul memory that's informing that, not necessarily as, Atlantis qua Atlantis, but as a paradigm, or again a mythological starting point for, you know, I don't know what you would call the journey away, or the protos, the emanation from that source point. But I see it very much so prevalent in those writings around the early 20th century, late 19th century. Just talking about, and a lot of it comes from Blavatsky's theory of the races. She calls them into play, the Atlanteans, the Lemurians, and it just kind of goes off the rails once you put the sort of ignition fluid that YouTube can be. When you throw that into the new age mix, it has a tendency to kind of go viral. And people, very interestingly these days, they put a lot of stock in stuff that's, got a relatively high view count on things like YouTube, when the information could be completely opinion. But that's you're right. I do have a lot of I interact with these people on a daily basis, so I do have a lot of kind of experience with them.
But I mean, like one of the things that I find fascinating is that if we remember that the Republic is an analogy for the soul, right? And that everything that Socrates is doing in the Republic is to try to describe the human soul in its concord state, right? Like when it reaches that point of harmony, right? And so that, we've got our epithumos, our thumos, and then our philosopher kings and queens, right? And when they're ordered in some such way, we are in harmony, or we have friendship with all the parts of what it means to be human. And that Socrates has apparently asked Timaeus and Critias and Hermocrates to construct stories that would animate this soul, right? This city and speech, or this harmonious. And Timaeus offers a cosmogony that shows that the entire cosmos is a harmony, even with discordant motion, even with the circle of the other, right? Like that, you can even bring that. You can bring the dimly lit and chaotically moving Cora into a kind of maternal embrace where everything kind of just fits and has a proper telos. And then Critias, right? He constructs two different cities, right? One, I would argue, is the is the republic, but Critias is then saying, haha, I also have a divine city. Because at first, right, this city of Poseidon, Atlantis, is actually the perfect city. And it's divinely ordained, and it passes on its wisdom from generation to generation. It stays divine, it stays virtuous for many generations. And it isn't until they stop reverencing the marriage of Plato and Poseidon at the heart of their city. So I would argue this divine feminine wisdom of the mother, of the Cora, of the Plato, of the famous one, that then they slip, right, and then they become not virtuous, and so here again, like, the philosopher kings and queens must be equal, and so the big problem is the loss of faith that comes from not telling the stories from generation to generation, that makes it to where Zeus sees them in their kind of hyper colonial. So this was the gifted Alcibiadian city, had so much potential and did for a long time, but then it slipped into hubris because of a lack of remembering its origins. And so part of me actually thinks that the Critias doesn't abruptly end, that it was meant to end there, because we were meant to remember the Symposium and the split aparts, and Zeus getting pissed, as he always does. And then, so I think the reference to twins is actually a reference to the myth of Aristophanes in the Symposium, of splitting like an egg, people in half. And so that's why we have twins. And that's what Zeus is going to do, is to split them in half, and never the twain shall they be put back together, except for prayers to love.
Because you mentioned
anyways,
the twins, and I was just completely drawing a blank. I've forgotten where they're mentioned in the Critias, but there's a reference to twins, because that's an interesting angle there that you're bringing in.
Yeah, Plato and Poseidon
Five
have
sets of
5
twins,
sets
okay.
of twins.
Yeah, that's right. They have 5 sets of twins,
yeah.
right.
And each one rules a different ring in Atlantis. And so
okay.
yeah.
I thought too that the ending is not just because Plato died or it was an abrupt thing, but it was intentional. Okay, but let's go with that for a minute. If it's intentional, where does that push us? Where does the ending push us? And it pushes us into a place of recognizing that these Atlanteans, who had stopped living the virtuous life, and they were placing external things over their internal things, that they're going to be brought back to tune, which is some sort of you're thinking that the punishment could be like what you see in the Symposium, where the twins are, where the people are split, so that we have to find our other half. So that you could say, laced throughout the Platonic writings is this notion of things that Zeus does to bring us back to tune. At least you see examples of it in the Symposium.
That look like penalties, but really are lessons or didactic moments. And so that, you think about the Apology, where Socrates says, look, if you really think I've done something wrong, teach me, right? So that this notion of the proper penalty is, give me the proper instruction, that's going to put me back into concord, right? That's going to bring harmony, versus the penalty of wag your finger or drink your hemlock, of shame or death. And so here, I think that one of the things that Plato is doing in this particular text is weaving back to mythologies that he's already constructed in the mouth of Aristophanes. And Aristophanes was very clued in to the Orphic mysteries, with eggs and all that fun stuff, and Mother Night and all that, Orphic kind of esoteric wisdom. And so I think he's cluing us in to themes, because this entire text is laced with themes to other Platonic dialogues. I think I could probably spend so the issue of the naming, right? For instance, Critias says, look, I'm going to say all these names in Greek, and that's okay, because that's what we do as syncretic thinkers, is that we understand that they had Egyptian names in the mouth of one person, and then other names in the mouth of another. But Solon did put it in Greek, and so I'm going to give the familiar Greek names, but occasionally he peppers it with the Egyptian names or the original names of the Atlanteans. And then one of the ways they pass on virtue in Atlantis is by passing on the divine names. And that's one of the things that they forget that causes them to be not virtuous. And so there's something really important about the naming practices or the names in this particular text. So it's Poseidon and Cleto. And that points, of course, to goodness, I'm blanking really quickly. Oh, you know what? The Cratylus. Sorry, I was like, where is that going? In any case, thank you. I'm sorry.
On that, and really briefly, he refers to Kekrops, Erechtheus, Erichthonius, Erechthon, and most of the recorded names before Theseus are names that he finds from Solon. But we know their names, but we don't know what they stood for and the world that they created, and that's what was lost. So it's by remembering the names then, that's the sort of the string that we can grab to pull ourselves back into virtue. But we have to start with the names, it sounds like.
Well, and it serves also as a another hint at the sort of the tokens placed throughout the mythology that he's creating here. This in the way that we would talk about something like the tokens of the gods diffused throughout the cosmos. There are tokens here, signs and tips that he's giving us in terms of, because the Cratylus is an exercise in effectively esoteric etymology, to a degree. And you even look at something like Clito, in late Greek, at least, it means hill. And where is she kept? On the hill. And then you look at Poseidon, right? He's lord of the seas and of the depths, the bowels, the profundity of the seas, and what's emerging out of what is he in love with? What is he infatuated with? The little hill that rises up, and right there you have something like the emergence of the egg from the primordial chaos. And so I mean that's straight out of the coffin texts in Egypt. The whole idea of Atum. Atum, the creator god, the one creative deity, emerges from the waters of Nun, which is void, chaos. We cannot conceive of it. This is the first point of conception. And he blooms he hatches from the egg, and he makes, respectively, fire and air. Shu and Tefnut, and you have there the water, the earth and the air, and you have these three primordial elements. So you see, that's how I look at this entire text is that I really kind of went deep. And here's the thing: I didn't sit there and analyze. I read it last night because I don't want to sit there and overanalyze, because what's going to happen is I'm going to read it and things are going to jump out almost as if the text itself turns red. And then from there, I can kind of wake up this morning and go back after I've bookmarked and kind of flesh these things out. And I really see an inversion of the Timaean cosmogony in the work of Poseidon here. I really see it. And it kind of went point for point by it. I mean, it's got similarities even to parts of the Old Testament, the similarities of the Genesis account of creation and the cosmos and all of that stuff. Particularly the first account of creation in Genesis, because there's two, right? In Genesis 1, there's a plurality of deities that create human beings in the cosmos, right? Elohim being this kind of weird mashup of a feminine verb with a masculine plural. And it's ultimately, that's why it says, Elohim says, let us make man in our image, so on and so forth. And you see that going on in the Critias, where the gods have been allotted to these various places, and now they're, by persuasion, they're turning people into these kind of sentient, intelligent beings, which is quite interesting. And the main thing there is, to me, like, I could go on, you could look at Deuteronomy, the Council of Elyon that takes place, where literally the highest God, Elyon, the God in the highest, divides the earth into nations that other supreme beings, other entities have allotment over. You're going to rule these people, you're going to rule that nation, so on and so. It's very similar to the allotment that's going on here. But the main thing that the bell that was ringing for me is the Edenic state. The ancient Athenian polis was the Edenic state for them. And then you have this creation that is not of the capital T or capital D demiurgus, but of Poseidon, who, if you look, and my thought in all this stuff is tainted with Proclean theology, of course, but he saw Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades as a triad of demiurges. Zeus being the highest, Poseidon being a medial demiurge. And if you look at what's going on, he's creating these concentric spheres, right? In the river, the land, the sea, the land, the sea, the land, and then the hill. He's creating 6 or really 7 concentric spheres in this kind of inversion of what we understand to be the cosmological, nested concentric spheres. It's something like Book 10 of the Republic in the myth of which is exactly.
I was just gonna bring
And
that
it even
up.
goes
Yeah,
further
go on.
than that, because there's a duality also that's being implied rather than a unity or a triplicity, because you've got the twins. Okay, Atlas is that he rules the center, but his twin Gadiros rules the periphery. And then you've got 2 sources of water that nourish the lands in great abundance, one of cold and one of hot. So this 2 contending forces of the realm of duality rather than the ultimate, then we're moving further away from the unity of the eternal upon which, the myth of the Timaeus is ultimately based. And there's, going back to the Cratylus and the epistemological tetrad, things like the Theaetetus, we're effectively bringing in those dialogues the Heraclitean axiom, this idea of flow, flux, change, and these 2 contending or opposing sort of temperatures, streams of water. They have underground sources, in the same way that he talks about the rivers of change, of phenomenal causality in something like the Cratylus and the Theaetetus. So then you see what's even weirder. He's allotting rulership to his sons the same way that allotment of the nations was given to the gods. It's an inversion. And Poseidon is this sort of generation working demiurge, especially according to Proclus. He's a medial demiurge that has to do with change, flux, flow, not eternity. And so then you can compare and contrast Plato's words to describe Atlantean society against the more austere Athenian people. He's right. So the Athenian farmers he describes as like having an eye to beauty, but he describes the artisans of Atlantis as wanting to delight themselves. There's a subtle difference. There. He uses words like that get translated as lavish, monumental, magnificent when describing the society of the Atlanteans, and he uses sparse words to describe the austere society. But the main thing, going back to the Edenic state, and I'll cap it here because this is where it applies to initiation and esoteric orders. You go back, and there's a lot that can be said about that whole blood ritual with the mixing bowls as like an inversion of the crater of the demiurge making world soul. They're putting bull's blood and anointing themselves and each other with it. It's very interesting. But if you go back to the Edenic state described in the first half of the text, he says that farmers were devoted only to the craft of farming. They had an eye to beauty. Right. This is in opposition to what came later, or the demiurgic or medial demiurgic craft of Poseidon. So the austere and temperate guardians, who he says have no need of gold or silver, who have no private possessions, who hold all things in common, are described as leaders of the Greek world. And he says specifically they are willingly followed. There's a clue. Because this is what he says about the logistikon, the highest part of the soul in that tripart delineation, must be willingly followed. by the lower two, the spirited and the appetitive. Farmers represent the appetitive, right? Because they're nourishing the body, but they're in their right place. The guardians are at the top. They're at the Acropolis. The farmers are at the bottom, at the slope, and they don't interfere with each other. The farmers choose to be led by the guardians, who are, again, using that analogy of verticality, that sort of hierarchy.
Well, because they could see and recognize the beauty, right, in being led, right? So this is how you create the harmony, is that like you educate your soul in such a way that the appetitive and the spirited, see and recognize, have enough wherewithal to be
Yeah,
like, yeah, of course they should lead. Because we get to fulfill our function. We get to be an appetite that's geared towards beauty. We
yeah,
get to be a spirited element that doesn't just fight for no reason. And so this is really interesting when you think about this particular text. If Timaeus is mirroring the Republic with his creation of the soul, demiurge and chora, so that you need both the demiurgic and the choratic, that you can't just have reason without necessity and necessity without reason. You can't have the kind of bastard, moving, flowing, feminine arche by herself, nor can you have the demiurgic, logical, always putting things together. You have to have the two to make the world soul, right? You need both the feminine and the masculine. And in the Republic, you have to have both feminine and masculine rulers, right? Soul. And so here, when we come to Critias' story, this agrarian, more idyllic Athens, right, is like the city of pigs. That Glaucon is like, no, that's too simple. Everything is met and everything. And so Socrates says, okay, you want a feverish city then. And then the whole of the Republic is bringing that feverish city back into concord with being in a Callipolis. And so that here now we see Athens is that city of pigs in this particular text, and Atlantis, right? It was the perfect city, or is the perfect city that needs to be purified of its fever, of its having gone to extremes. And so again, this is a beautiful text that does that work of the indefinite dyad, of the greater that could always be greater and the lesser that can always be lesser. And so that we internalize this, right? This extremes of too simple, too idyllic, and then too out there, too crazy. And so that we marry these two cities and see that there is a mean, right, within ourselves that can be both tending towards the Atlantean, right, this divine part of ourselves. So Proclus and the Neoplatonists would say, look, one of the reasons why we make mistakes when it comes to virtue is not because we are bad or horrible. No, it's because of the reasoning principles in our soul, the divine aspects in our soul that make us be ambitious or overzealous or attracted to gold and things like this, because it appears that it is like those things. So our tendency to become excessive or Atlantean is actually because of the divine part of our soul, but we're cut off from it, right? We don't have a perfect picture of it, like the twins. They're cut off, or at least that's what I would argue is going to happen, is they're cut off from their divine part, but they can still sense their other half. They can still feel it. And so we reach for it. And so we have to learn to measure it, but also just to become the agrarian idyllic. Yeah, that's going to be a nice city of pigs life, but you're not actually doing that much to connect, to heal, or be joined to your more than mortal half. So if you want to just be human, that's the perfect way of life. But maybe there's more than just the Athenian idyllic state.
That comes right out of what Danny just said. So we've got these tendencies that are not intrinsically bad, but they're expressed poorly, and they lead us into a life that's not virtuous. You could see this all over in Plato. Alcibiades seems like the perfect example of some guy who has these great ideas, but he just doesn't know how to implement them, and he becomes grandiose and so on. Where in this text, say in the Critias, or how it relates to the Timaeus or the Republic, what is the way to address that? Does Plato give us a way to bring us back into tune through these texts? Because he stops the Critias where he stops it, and it might make us think, well, what the hell? What should we do? And Plato might be saying, well, I've already told you what to do. Just go back and look at the Republic, look at the Timaeus, and apply it to yourselves and see what in you is like the Atlanteans who have lost it, and how can you bring yourself back? but that requires a lot of, I mean, I loved what you were saying, Ike, about how Atlantis, as described in the Critias, is sort of like an inverted mirror of the cosmology of the Timaeus, with all its rings and its planets and all that. And so he's got these rings right here on the earth, and he sort of made it an inverted mirror of the divine world in this world, and that works out for a while until they blow it. So they're sort of living a cosmogonic society until they fall out of it, fall out of tune.
Yeah.
I wish, do either of you have some sort of sense of where the texts show us how we fall out of tune? Or maybe falling out of tune is inevitable and not to be resisted and just accepted and worked through, that it's a part of like breathing. It's like saying, okay, how are you going to avoid breathing out? You know, it's part of the process. Falling out of tune might be part of the,
Yeah.
being in tune.
That's what makes it animated, right? Like Socrates is asked for,
Yeah.
put in motion, right? In a state of war. Put my Callipulus in a state of war, in motion is what he's asked Timaeus and Critias and Hermocrates, whose texts we never see. But the point is that no, I mean, like to go back to Ike's point about allotments, right? That here the gods, Poseidon has been allotted, right, his place. They don't war for them. So pushing back against Hesiod and Homer with regards to how gods establish their regions. No, this was by allotment and persuasion, and so it harkens to this myth of right, where the fates and the sirens, and they've given us this chance. It's all like we get to pick our lives, but we have to discern correctly. We are allotted and sown. I mean, so there's an allusion here to the gods have gone through this cycle too, right? Poseidon has been allotted. He's picked this particular life. And so that ultimately, yes, this is what happened when Poseidon was alive. He fell in love with Cleto and established this region. And then eventually his people, his race, starts to forget the origin story from a divine fair allotment. But that doesn't, we have Zeus come back, and it's going to put things back in right order in some such way, if we can see the connections between this text and another text and another text. And then also to be able to listen to somebody today, like I think about my mother who believed in Atlantis, and to be able to see that there's still some wisdom in that, right? Because it harkens to a story that must have helped a lot of people in this crazy world that we're
And another
existing
thing, in
in.
terms of context, for people who aren't aware, Plato was living in a time where Athens was much more like Atlantis, right? At the time of the tyrants and all of this sort of stuff, and many of which were his, as at least we get from the seventh letter, many of which were his relatives, and he walked away from that. So I think part of it is him trying to intinct, right, the modern sort of time that is tending towards intemperance. They've not yet, descended to abject chaos and ruin, and but he kind of alludes to that by saying, like, look, the Atlanteans could handle this for a little while, but then eventually, this worldly desires left to kind of satisfy and gratify their own ends are going to pull us down. And I think one of the ways that he's doing is he's trying to hearken to the past, to sort of blend or at least bring to consciousness what was, or at least in a mythological way, to the intemperance and sort of the chaos or tyranny of the Athens he was living in. Now, what's really interesting to me is center. This, focusing on the center. There's so many different points in this mythology where he's saying the center, and he's calling that mound of Cleto. What is that, right? When he assigns it, right, it has a gold wall, and it's the nuptial point, or the point of generation where Poseidon and Cleto marry or copulate with one another and create the twins, and then Atlas gets it's the best part of it's the choice pick, choice cut of the whole property. Atlas gets, that's yours, buddy. You go and have a great time. And then that is the center of the world. And it's interesting because Atlas, right, being Telamon Atlas, kind of the similarity in the name there, it's kind of, there's this idea of axis mundi, which we also get from in the spindle of Anagke in something like the myth of Ur. But the main point there is that we end this text with Plato saying Zeus calls the gods together to their abode, which is in the center of everything, from which they can see all of creation. And yet we end there because he doesn't tell us. And then he says, dot, dot, dot. Look who. So that's really interesting to me. Is replacing this place of gold, this earthly mound, this nuptial chamber with the gods, all of the gods, and I don't know that he means that in like a strictly, pious observance way, so much as I think, to your point, Danny, this, I don't believe, Critias, that he means that this is historical. I think that he's continuing the analogy of the governance of the internal polis. And I think that hasn't, I haven't figured it out conclusively, but I think that has in some way to do with it, bringing the gods back to the center.
Well, we also have to remember, to bring it back into context, historia, right, at the time was not what we consider. I think of Proclus, like for him, he was trying to say, like, he uses the word historia, and we mean by it now something that was factually true. But as Aristotle would say, historical events, they're not very, who cares? Because they're all just a bunch of hodgepodge events that now don't have any telos or purpose that combines them. What really matters is that, we tell stories that have a beginning, middle, and end, so that we can follow them, right? Like if you just do history where you're just throwing up, this event happened, this person existed, because that's how we experience it. We don't experience, right, most of the time in our lives, a story with a beginning, middle, and end. But history, right, was starting to become an art that crafted the evental nature with a beginning, middle, and end, created a drama or a story. And so that when Critias says this is absolutely history, he's just the beginning of a tradition, right? Rather than, actually like meaning that this is factually true. Because as Proclus says, we don't really care if it's factually true or not, right? This is a late Neoplatonist. Like, what really matters is what it teaches us about being connected to the divine, being, what it means to be virtuous and good and true, because that's what's really history, right? That we really do have these capacities to become more than just, people enslaved to the tyrant at the time, right? People enslaved to the techno-feudalists who have all the money and the goods, all that fun stuff. I would be remiss if I didn't ask what you think, both of you think, Orcalium is. So here's in this text, they not only have silver and gold, but they have this very interesting bronze orchilum. I'm sorry, it's just one of those strange words. Like, does either of you have any idea what this strange metal is? This speaks the reception of this particular text and myth in the weird world of alchemical or alchemists. And so I don't know much there in that world. So I would love to hear what
Well,
you guys
so
think.
it's the two words that are
It's a
smashed
common word
together.
on its own, but it's a variation of the Latin word.
Sorry.
Yeah, we can go with that. I know that the two words translate. I think it's oros and chalkos or chalkis, and it means mountain copper. I don't necessarily know what that is, but I would say the fact that in some way copper is associated with it, it's interesting. It's interesting, certainly from an alchemical
Yeah.
perspective, being a Venusian metal, which ultimately comes from, right, Greek mythology. That's the meaning of the word Cyprus, right? Or at least that's what it was named after later. So I've seen it translated as mountain copper, but I don't really know. I don't know what, like, I couldn't point to a specific metal and tell you what that was.
Yeah, no, I
Yeah.
have in my text mountain copper as well, and then I was like bronze, and then I was like, oh, okay, does this correspond to the different the noble lie, right? Where we're supposed to be thinking about the various different metals, but I don't
Well,
think
and
that
what's
works at
interesting too is
all.
he says something about when they're in that chamber. I think he says something when they're sacrificing the bulls. He says that they have all sorts of instruments, but no weapons of iron, which is interesting to your point about the possibility of it being bronze.
Question that kind of relates
Yeah.
to the way that you like to look at this, Danny. So you kind of taking the whole spectrum of its relation to the other dialogues. Ike is more going into more in the symbolic depth of the story itself. But what's provided in the Critias that is not provided, say, in the other dialogues that you've been referring to, the Symposium or the Timaeus or the Republic? What does this provide that they don't have? What clue?
Yeah, I honestly, that's one of the reasons why I'm so excited to talk to you guys about this particular text, is because it, I don't know. I really, and I love that. I love that there's I mean, all the dialogues do this, right? Like the Cratylus is another famous example of a text that just seems so anti-Plato. Like when we want to think about the standard traditional Plato that you get in your classroom, the rationalist who really wants you to just be logical and ordered and to do philosophy, and dialectic is just parsing things out like Parmenides does, and that sophistry is just Protagoras. Like the Cratylus and the Critias, and let's see, I'm sure I'll think of another one that really kind of smack those kind of scholars in the face and say, remember he's weird too, right? Remember he's also a mythologist. Remember he's also a folk etymologist. Remember that he plays with the sacred traditions of punnings and secret words and divine names and myths that seem to be heretical, right? And somehow they're not. So, because this should be heretical, right? What he's doing. If you're starting you're following the standard stories of the gods. I mean, he even makes in this particular text, Athena and Hephaestus come from the same father. That's not right. Who's their same father? Hephaestus was supposed to be born of Hera, and Athena of Zeus. But here we're supposed to be like, well, I guess the demiurge is what makes them united because of the Timaeus. And so for me, this text is just a good mimetic device, if you will, or a device of remembering that Plato was very complex, and that to get Plato requires a little bit of magic. And so,
With this difficult task that Critias has in front of him, it's bringing it into ordinary life, into our world, and that was sort of the goal from the beginning. How do you describe? What was it when we go to war? Was that right? Which requires an understanding of human nature and how to bring these exalted ideas down into activity, which is what it required.
And it kind of alludes to this double meaning too, potentially in the opening sort of preface of him saying, "Look, it's difficult to talk about, people, maybe individuals, maybe the human experience in relation to a lot of this stuff." But I think that's why there's so much recourse to mythologizing rather than speaking directly, because um, I think it's he's giving you all the tools in the broader context of his work, not only in the Republic. I mean, if you okay, so after digesting the Republic, you go back through the Alcibiades, you go back through the Gorgias, you go back through, let's say, the Iamblichian curriculum. He's constantly, like, it doesn't stop. He's constantly contrasting moral, or I would say a crisis of virtue against, you know, uh, his four cardinal virtues. He's constantly saying, they he I think invokes in the Gorgias or the Alcibiades the Archelaus, the tyrannical ruler of Persia at the time, and he's talking about he doesn't have temperance and then courage and prudence, and he's constantly using those four cardinal virtues to contrast against what is going wrong with this situation. So I think another mythological take on the governance of the internal polis. I think personally, there's something very interesting to me about the inversion, the potential of the inverted myth, because when you see stuff in throughout occultism, and I know that's occult symbolism, but it's one of the reasons why Danny wanted me to come and be a part of this discussion. One of the things that you see constantly is the demiurgic sort of creative intellect of the divine in an inverted mirror, as in like the hexagram. You see that in Eliphas Levi's Doctrine and Ritual of High Magic, as above, so below. But the thing is, it's not exact. What is below is an inversion. It's a dark reflection. And to me, I mean, there's something extremely, and this is a dirty word, but I'm going to use it. There's something extremely Gnostic about that.
Nice.
I think you're onto something that's pretty significant there, Ike. And you characterize it as kind of Gnostic. And it strikes me or makes me think that this is something that an individual human being in his or her own kind of, you could say, egocentric self has a way of being able to participate in the highest and most exalted trans-egoistic state. I mean, that's a hell of an inversion from the most non-ego to the most empowered ego. But is that part of what you're talking about? Because
Yeah.
I know it sounds kind of creepy. It almost sounds like black magic or something like that, like some big sorcerer. But there's an element of that. How do human beings participate in the divine without just becoming vaporous, sort of go along and get along? How do they own it and embody it and act it? And that can't happen just by passivity. So
No,
is
I
that what you're
think
getting at?
yeah, I definitely do. I think what he's telling us here is that it's actually not the natural state of human beings. I think that we come here and there's a potential for it, but I would say you know the watchword of or the keyword for the realm of generation is contention, right? Constantly the twins, the two different streams. Yeah, strife is a good term for that too. And that to overcome this contention, which is ultimately, it's not a product of any flaw of the material universe, it's a product of our perception of it. This whole idea that things are constantly in flux and constantly changing, yet we were insisting on finding capital T truth only here in the material, which was very much a pre-Socratic kind of preoccupation for many of those early natural philosophers. I think what he's pointing to is something that Pythagoras is known to have emphasized. The Orphic traditions have known to mythologize. Is the descent of the soul into the underworld of materiality, and how we can. The whole point I brought up the Edenic state is because we can return to that Edenic state, but it's an internal thing. The guardians have to not have any use for gold or silver. That doesn't mean nobody else gets to use it. But the guardian, the highest part of the soul, the logistikon, that which approximates the divine in us, has to rule the roost, and it has to be willing, because it doesn't follow logically. It's not in the nature of the logistikon to beat something into submission. So it has to be assented by the two. We're going to do our part. We're going to focus on, William Wynne Westcott, one of the founders of the Golden Dawn, he wrote in one of the flying rolls, in one of the first flying rolls, and this is an introductory teachings to the inner order of the Golden Dawn in 1892. He wrote, the animal man is to be cared for, but not petted. And essentially what Plato's talking about in the intemperance that eventually was the downfall of the Atlanteans is delighting and extravagance and that kind of stuff. Why? Because we are enthrall to the illusion of this stuff, which brings us further and further towards the rule of flux and change and further away from the stability of the austere guardians who lead the Greek world. And so I think it's another way of mythologizing that in line with the Timaeus, the Republic, right? So that I don't think at all it's this asceticism. I don't think it's this checking out. I think it's a checking in. Check in with yourself. Like that's what that critical ray that you're trying to analyze everything in the exterior world, that has to be turned in on yourself. And I think it's a powerful message for today, for people today. It's like you don't all the problems are out here. No, that you've got problems in an interior sort of perceptual filter issue. I think ultimately that's why I gravitated so much to Platonism. I was rereading it and going like, oh my God, like everything we're dealing with today, he'd already discussed. He already went through all of these issues of perceptual kind of confusion. So I think that has something to do with it. I'm clearly look around. I like nice things. I like nice food, right? I'm not like this world denying ascetic, but I certainly think, especially with my history as an addict, if I can speak frankly, with my history as an addict, I mean, addiction is only one of the most extreme examples of what the mind is continually doing. It's only the
Just say a little bit more about that, please. Help me understand that, because I think you're onto something there. So that the addiction reveals something that's intrinsic to who we are.
yes, and addicts are just people who decide to take that ride and lose a sense of interior groundedness and self-preservation. And a lot of that is ultimately the font, right? The font of self-preservation is the interior groundedness, is knowing, having that strong connection to the logisticon. And
Let me ask you, the what drives the addiction, though, is a desire for a kind of intensity of experience, right? Am I right
I
about
think at
that?
first, the
Yeah.
thrill seeking is how you get hooked, but addiction itself, when persisted in, right, because we call it a temporary lapse in insanity, it's temporary insanity, is a preference for the lie over the truth. I
That
have
makes it that
checked out.
I appreciate what you're saying, but it sounds so abstract. That's not the language of the addict. They
Yeah,
don't
well, the
think
addict
in
says,
those.
I want to check out. I don't want to feel this pain. I don't want to feel the burden of responsibility. I want to lay here and take this drug, and I want the drug to make me feel good, and I don't want to have to do anything. That's a lie.
But if I go back to what Danny was talking about earlier, this impulse to bring, I call it pleasure, if you want, or a release from pain, in itself is not bad. It's how we manage it that's the question. So you can recognize that there's no difference between the addict and me. It's just how they manage their impulse to that experience.
Well, yeah, I mean, what we would consider the highest part of the soul has no say in the actions of the addict. It's not. I mean, there have been. I'll put it this way: there have been times where I was, and I'm getting very frank, very real, but it's, whatever. You can edit out whatever you don't like, but
No, this is great.
there
This
have
is
been times
real.
when I'm sitting there about to do something I know I shouldn't do. And an inner voice in me is screaming, do not do this, do not do this. You haven't done it yet. You can turn this around. And there's a part of me that just says no. And I think that there is, right, this whole architecture or this analogy of the relationship between those contending voices in us is what Plato is trying to, in some way, draw us to look at. I mean, because and you can say, well, that's a modern kind of psychological interpretation. Yeah, but go back to the Theaetetus, go back to the epistemological tetrad where he's talking about philosophical midwifery. I mean, that's proto-psychology. That's an early form of what would become psychological doctrine to people like Freud and Jung and so on and so forth. So I think that there is
There's a reason why. Freud has the theories that he has. It's based on deep reading of Republic and Plato, and so like psychology is born from these kind of initial investigations. And what you're talking to, right, is this again? We're going back to these three parts of the soul, and the epithumos, and we satisfy it, and we have this agrarian city, but that's as Galkan said, it's too simple. That's a city of pigs, right? That's too idyllic, right? Like, and so there's a Glaucon in all of us, particularly in the addict, right? It's like, that's just too simple. I want the more than. And then Socrates is like, okay, you're my friend. So again, modeling that you can be friends with people you disagree with. You can be friends with that part of your soul that wants more, right? To go back to your Gnostic, you said here, like lots of Gnostics think that Gnosticism is just intuition all by itself. But I would argue, like, one of the things that makes this text so awesome is that it's peppered with all of these moments of there being seeds or small things and details that are passed on or important, that you need both the odd and the even. You need these small things, these little legumes that's all throughout. I mean, he mentions these seeds that you got to find, these small things. And that's when you pick up on them, you're gaining the breadcrumbs, so to speak, to make that thread, as Greg saw, that exists between your stomach, your desire for pleasure, and the more than to produce, and connecting them. And so that the real Gnostic is one who knows that it's not just knowing for no reason, right? But I've studied this text 1,000 times. I've studied the Republic 1,000 times, and now I can see the little seeds that are there. And so for me, those epiphanies don't come from nowhere. They come. And so I think, unfortunately, Gnosticism has gotten the bad rap of we just know, because we read one or two mystical texts. And I'm saying, I'm sorry. Just because you know who Hermes Trismegistus is doesn't mean that you've actually been initiated in any way. Rather, there's a discipline that requires, because one of the things that's happening in the Timaeus and in this text is this is the soul in war, in strife, animated. And so really what we're learning about is not the logisticon nor the epithumos. We're learning about what connects the two of them, the warriors, the heart, the spirit, the passion, to study something that looks so silly and obscure, but you committed yourself to marrying the addict with the overthinker, and that you are passionate enough to be right and true and just about that and to protect it and defend it. And so that I would argue that Timaeus and the Critias are texts about different ways we can fashion the warrior. We'll make lies, we'll make myths, we'll make podcasts in order to protect the value of the stamp or the seal or the measure between the thinking thing and the desiring thing. And so, but that's just my hot take. So I don't know how you guys
I'm
respond
wondering
to
if
that.
Greg has any thoughts, or you're muted, Greg, by the way. I wonder if Greg has any thoughts or intuitions on this addict sort of addiction connection.
Well, that's interesting. I think that I just want to say that this is a whole lot more interesting of a meeting about Critias than I thought it would be, because when I read Critias, I thought, I don't know, what am I going to do with this? I mean, I didn't really have much enthusiasm for the Critias when I read it. But listening to you guys talking about what you're getting out of it, I'm really fascinated, and I really find this connection to the other dialogues really interesting. A couple of the themes that have come up that I'm interested in knowing more about is the soul in war, that strife, contention, is a necessary part of what we are called upon to do in our discipline, to bring this cosmogony that's described in the Timaeus, this perfect place, into a lived reality. That contention cannot be escaped. You can't just dream your way into it with kumbaya songs and everybody being nice to everybody else. It's hard. And as far as addiction goes, I think that I'm not sure I quite understand my own tendencies towards addiction. Um, let's think about like when people take psychedelics, for example, and suddenly they have an experience of what they, you know, they never knew before, and they suddenly realize that there's no difference between them and the universe, and they realize that they are the universe. Why shouldn't they think of that as a kind of gnosis? But the question is, how do you live that? You know, how do you implement that? How do you recognize how it can be received and then how it can be dropped? I mean, if it's a gift, it's almost guaranteed to be fall out of our hands unless we do some training. And that's where reading these Platonic dialogues helps, because he shows you ways in which this kind of experience can be contained, you could say, and not lost. And that's what's interesting about Plato, is that I don't know how. I'm just in awe of this material, really, to be honest. And this notion of strife, which is one of Empedocles's, there's strife and eros. We always tend to think, oh, everything, eros is the good thing and strife is bad. But strife is absolutely necessary, you know, for our waking up, you could say. And if we're just in this erotic sort of like, oh, let's be happy, let's be like Donovan's song, way down below the ocean where I want to be, you know, Atlantis and all that stuff, it doesn't work, you know. I don't know how much experience you've had with, I don't think New Age people are bad, but how would I put this? They bore the hell out of me, you know, with all their pleasantness and happiness and love. I mean, it doesn't have enough grit. It doesn't have enough. I don't agree with you, or I think you're wrong, or that guy's really off. You're not allowed to say that in these wonderful attempts to bring this vision into real life. Everybody thinks that the way to do it is to be nice to everybody, and the strife and the war is the only way to bring it out. And I don't know. I guess I'm kind of confusing it. I mean, I like for people to have good manners. Yes, that's good. But how to have really serious critique of another person idea and still be polite is a real art. And I don't know that we've really learned that very well.
That is the dialectic. You know, we like look, for instance, I think
Yeah.
people are afraid of contention because they think it has to be knocked down, drag out, or I'm embarrassed. People are afraid to seem foolish, afraid to be wrong, especially nowadays. And you look at something like the Gorgias, where Callicles is like sort of lashing back out at Socrates, and the whole time Socrates is telling him, listen, no, you're taking this personally. You're taking this personally. You're getting upset with me because you're taking it personally. And what I'm trying to do is work with you. And that's the difference between sophistry and what they do in the dialectic. Is one is collaborative, the other one is contentious, purely contentious. It's a competition. Somebody needs to win. And I think a lot of people that are invested in this idea of like, just be cool, man. They're afraid of having that confrontation when, if you look at the dialogues, it can happen. And I mean, even in sporting events, there's this idea of sportsmanship where if you box or you play tennis or something, you lose, you go and you shake that guy's hand or that woman's hand at the end of the match. And this is, I mean, I think that's just part of self-development, that to be able to do that. So yeah, that's, I mean, has I guess, very little to do with Platonism, but that's my take on being around a lot of that.
For me,
No, I was just going to say, I
I'm
don't
sorry.
think it
Go ahead.
doesn't have to do with Platonism. I think it has very much to do with it. Go ahead, Danny.
Yeah, no, because he's always making that distinction between eristic discussions, say in the Meno, versus yeah, friendlier discussions. Like so, if I was in a competition, this wouldn't work, but here we're having a friendly discussion. And again, my read of the Republic, where the entire rules for war and how that works is in order to show this is what a proper dialectic would look like. You don't just leave people's bodies, right? You don't argue on ad hominem. Basically, you don't raise and burn, and you maintain a sense of decorum. At least that's what I read into all the rules for war in the Republic. It's teaching us how can you have arguments and disagreements in some way that doesn't actually mean that you destroy the other person. Rather, you take from them, you learn from them, even when they are wrong. I mean, that's what Socrates. So I wrote my entire dissertation in my 20s because I wanted to read Socrates as sincerely saying compliments to these so-called sophists, because I wanted to believe that it's not just being ironic, that Socrates actually sincerely sees, oh, Thrasymachus, I'm really trying to learn from you, man. And yeah, you are a dog, or you are, calling me names, but I'm gonna still tell you a story. And so that by the time Thrasymachus comes back in book 6, like they've become friends, like, because Thrasymachus sees that, oh, I get it. This is what philosophy is, as opposed to what I've been practicing most of my life, which is the competition, where I have to slaughter the other, take them down a peg, rather than just point out what you're confused about, right? And what you wish you understood better. So I've taken up a lot of y'all's time. So I figured I could close with the
Before
last
you do that,
paragraph.
what
Go ahead.
was your thesis? Did it have a title? Yeah, when you wrote about
Oh,
it.
my thesis? Yeah, it was called, yeah, Double Ignorance, an
Oh, I've read
examination of
an
Socratic
article
moral
you've written
wisdom.
about double ignorance, so maybe some of it was put into that.
Hmm.
Yeah,
Probably, yeah, yeah, because it was my attempt to solve the paradox of how Socrates can admit ignorance while saying ignorance is
right.
the worst
No,
thing in the
yeah,
world. And so I was like,
no,
I
no,
gotta figure
that
this
was
one
good.
out. So
No, I enjoyed reading
this is
that.
a
Yeah.
little puzzle.
Okay. So, not. I'm sorry to interrupt. How did you want to bring this to a close?
So I thought I just read the last paragraph. I think it speaks to everything that we have said about internalization, embodiment, yeah, and how all of these myths, in some such way, reflect the human condition, and this kind of slip into the kind of discordant way of being in the world, caused by, as we'll hear. All right. Where'd it go? Where'd it go? All right. As a result, then, of such reasoning and the continuance of their divine nature, all their wealth had grown to such a greatness as we previously described. But when the portion of divinity within them was now becoming faint and weak, because being oftentimes blended with a large measure of mortality, whereas the human temper was becoming dominant, then at length they lost their comeliness through being unable to hear the burden of their possessions, and became ugly to look upon in the eyes of him who has the gift of sight. For they had lost the fairest of their goods from the most precious of their parts. But in the eyes of those who have no gift of perceiving what is the truly happy life, it was then above all that they appeared to be superlatively fair and blessed, filled as they were with ambition and power. And Zeus, the god of gods, who reigns by law, uh, inasmuch as he has the gift of perceiving each thing, marked how their righteous race was in evil plight, and desired to inflict punishment upon them. To that end, when chastised, they might strike a truer note. Wherefore he assembled together all the gods into the abodes which they honor most, standing as it does at the center of the universe, and beholding all things that partake of generation. And when he had assembled, then he spoke. Dot, dot, dot. So again, just this idea that when we blend our origins with this mortal, this thing that's going to die, with just the simple or the agrarian, we are slowly but surely getting rid of the divine portion that makes us go beyond that mortal idyllic, everything's perfect life. But of course, as we've been noting, it's going to require a bit of strife to get back that divine portion.
Make the conclusion to this dialogue. Right.
I want all of us to write the
would be
conclusion
fun.
to this. It
Well-
would. I think so too.
No,
Any
thanks
last thoughts,
for
guys, before we go?
bringing this event up, and I've enjoyed it thoroughly. Thank you.
Same. Yeah. Thanks for having me.
Oh, dear.